I got some. My mic is always blocking them. Let's do this. The Cult of Hockey podcast by the faithful and for the faithful. I'm David Staples of the Edmonton Journal, and I'm here today with Bruce McCurdy and a special guest from Pender Island, from his secret enclave, Kurt Leavins. Welcome, Kurt.
Hi, fellas. I don't know if I'm special.
You're special to us.
I'll buy guest, but anyway, thanks for the introduction. It's great to be here as always.
Kurt, you've been again leading the way in many regards in terms of coming up with some interesting hockey trade rumors involving the Oilers. And it strikes me, and I'm just trying to, I know I've been reading rumors in recent weeks that the Oilers have been thinking of moving a defenseman. And one of the thoughts with Klefbom is they don't know if they can trust his health. And did you put that out, Kurt? And I'm just trying to think if you tweeted that out, or was it in one of your columns, or has someone else saying that?
You might remember I put out the OEL thing a couple of weeks ago, and specifically I said I've been told by someone who knows the player. To be clear, I don't know the player, but I've been told by someone who does know the player that he's willing to waive. That ain't an issue. And the ties between the coaching staff. Think not just Tippett. There's two guys behind that bench that OEL has played for and really, really respected. So there's no issue with him coming here. And from what I understand, the organization, they like Oscar Klefbom. However, this is a guy that has played 66, 61, and 62 games the last 3 seasons. He's always hurt. And it's hard to count on a guy who you're using as your 1D when he's only playing 4/5 of a season. And I think at some point the Oilers decided, if we're really going to move forward, we have to have someone who we can count on day in and day out. And I think Oliver Ekman-Larsson's only missed 12 games in the last 7 years, like really, really durable. And it's fair to argue he's maybe not an elite 1D anymore, but certainly he's a 1D. Maybe he's, somewhere between 15 and 20. But on the Oilers, he would immediately become your number one defenseman by a mile. And so I think that's what the Oilers are looking at, is they just don't think they can count on Klefbom health-wise. And the McDavid clock is ticking. They've got to do something here. And I don't think they feel they have a couple of years to just bring a defense along without Oscar Klefbom, who looks like he could be going on LTIR. I think they feel they need to do something now in order to keep the train moving forward.
So, Bruce, I'm going to ask you, I'm going to first read Elliot Friedman's quote this morning, Bruce, and I'm going to get you to react. This is from Elliot Friedman today, and his quote is, quote, "One situation Edmonton is monitoring. Oscar Klefbom is weighing options to deal with injuries from last season. One of the possibilities is surgery that could keep him out long term." And in parentheses, obviously, we don't know when next season will begin. His absence would need to be addressed, unquote. Bruce, how did you take that news today?
I took it the same way as that oft-used Bruce Boudreau gif, where the subtitle says "darn," and if you read his lips, you'll see something else. So this is a family podcast. I'll say "darn." The thing that baffles me is the Oilers played their last game on August the 8th. If he's contemplating surgery, how come it's September 30th and we're still contemplating the surgery? Like, at what point do you make a darn decision and get it done?
Bruce, this is baffling, and this rumor on some this rumor coming out baffles me. Who does it benefit? Usually, when a rumor comes out, the first thing I ask myself, who does this benefit? Who leaked this to Elliot Friedman? Elliot Friedman is, of course, highly credible NHL reporter. Probably, he's the best NHL reporter right now. He's the most tuned in NHL reporter. This is credible information. So he could have just pieced it together, like as he does. Like he sometimes just pieces things together. He's hearing this, that, puts the 3 things together, comes up with this. This seems highly specific information, though, coming from one source, probably. I'm guessing. Who is that source? Who does this information benefit? Because it doesn't seem like it benefits the Edmonton Oilers. Like, do you want
Not very happy.
Klefbom's market being dropped down. Now, of course, my other thought is any serious trading partner, let's say there was a team really interested in Klefbom, you couldn't hide this from them, right? I don't think you could. This isn't the NHL era where you could, maybe 50 years ago or 40 years ago, you could hide this kind of thing and trade a player. But in today's world with contracts, insurance, all that kind of stuff, there would need to be complete and utter disclosure. So any team that was really serious with the Oilers, I'm guessing the Oilers have put this news out to other teams that they're dealing with some time ago. So maybe this would benefit that team in trying to drive down the price of Klefbom, or like, make the Oilers pay more for something. The leak could have come from there. But I'm just guessing at this point. I have no idea, but this is not a happy moment necessarily for the Oilers, even if any other team trying to trade for Klefbom would have had all this information. Kurt, in terms of OEL, I'm not like, I know that on Bob Stauffer's show, he's talked to a number of hockey experts, Brian Burke and I think Brian Lawton. These are two really smart hockey guys. And they have both said, like you, that OEL is 10 to 15 ranked in the NHL, like a top number one D-man. When I look at the statistics, Kurt, and these are basic statistics, how much does the coach trust you to play in overtime, shorthanded, even strength? How many points are you putting up in some of those situation shots on net? So these are pretty telling stats. OEL doesn't rank in the top 15 in the NHL in these numbers. And this includes time on ice, the trust of the Arizona coaching staff in him. He ranks 57th. So I would say he's a top pairing defenseman at this point by the numbers. Now, we can also go by what we've seen of OEL. And that's been a little bit, from an Oilers fan's perspective, in the games we've seen him in recent years, has not been entirely encouraging. He's been beaten by McDavid a number of times. So I'm just worried that my whole fear on this whole thing is this 7 more years, $8.25 million for a 29-year-old defenseman who was a number one defenseman, and Tippett certainly will remember him that way in his mind, but he's not that player anymore. So I'm really hesitant on this deal. Now, Klefbom being hurt changes it somewhat for me, but I also think Caleb Jones is ready to step up. I've been saying that for some time. I actually believe that to be true.
Well, the problem is Caleb Jones isn't ready to be a 1D or even a 3-4. A good organization start a guy like him as a 5-6, right? And if the Oilers are doing it right, I think that's what they should do. With great respect, I think you're being tough on OEL. If you take a look, one, durability, I've already mentioned, he never misses any time. His time on ice, the last 2 seasons, is 30 seconds off his career average. So his time on ice hasn't changed measurably. And the other thing that I would point out is in the last 18 months, OEL lost a parent. And from what I understand, he was very, very, very close to that parent. We saw the impact of losing a father had on Adam Larson. Think a comparable impact on this player. Time heals all wounds, they say. If that's the case, there's some explanation why perhaps his play has been off a little bit the last season. If we kind of put 1 and 1 together, I think we get 2. The other thing is, you mentioned
been on a crappy team.
He's been on a crappy team, and as you say, McDavid's beat him a couple times. Well, I'll put that on my business card. NHL defenseman, McDavid has beat me a couple times. Join the club. Yeah. So I'm with you that I think at one time he was one of the top 5 defensemen in the NHL. I don't think he's that now, but I still strongly believe he's a 15-20 and a number one every day of the weekend, twice on Sundays on an Oilers club. And I think he would be for at least the next 3-4 years, which is that time that's ticking on the McDavid clock, as I referred to before.
So this would be the first pick this year, Kurt? The Oilers would give up, plus Russell, plus James Neal?
Yeah, I know you'd love that salary to go the other direction. What I suspect is that Arizona is asking for a defensive prospect in addition to the one in Russell. And I'll talk about Russell in a second. I'm sure they would like Broberg or Bouchard. I'm positive the Oilers don't want to give up either one of them. Would you make this deal in a flat cap era where Arizona is really, really shy on cash if you put Dmitry Samorukov in that deal? I think Arizona would think about it. So yes, I think they'll want a prospect, but I think Ken Holland will do everything he can to not make Evan Bouchard a part of that deal.
Bruce, what's your first? Bruce, what do you think about Kurt and I have a? I'm not actually saying that I'm right about OEL as just a top pairing D-man because I haven't seen him enough myself to make that statement with confidence. I'm just going by some pretty indicative numbers and a limited viewing, so I could easily be wrong, and I'll grant you that, Kurt. But I'm not sure everyone else weighing in on whether OEL is a true number one defenseman has seen him play 30, 40 times last year, for instance, either, which I think is what you need to do to make that kind of assessment. And the Oilers should be doing it right now. If they're not doing their job. But they have that's his job to do that, right? To make that assessment, to watch that team every game. So that's not me. Bruce, what's your take on his play?
Well, one area where he is top 5 in the NHL is he is the number 5 highest cap hit of any defenseman currently, behind Erik Karlsson, Drew Doughty, Roman Josi, PK Subban, and that's it. That's all. So by taking on that kind of a cap hit, you expect that kind of a performance, and that's for 7 years out. So, I mean, mind you, in the future, he probably will gradually work down that list as contracts maybe start to pick up again 2 or 3 years from now. But that's a heavy price to pay. And then the acquisition cost on top of that, it's the double whammy that is of concern. The Oilers don't have a lot of cap space. Now, presuming that Klefbom might wind up on long-term injured reserve, that creates some cap space, but it comes with a few headaches as to how they get him in there. And moving out the 1 year of Chris Russell's contract, I mean, that creates room this year, and that was space that we knew that was coming next summer no matter what. Well, if you move out Russell, that solves half of the first year of OEL's cap hit, and then you're left with the 6 additional years at $8 million. You're not freeing up cap space there. On the good side, I mean, Kurt mentioned Adam Larson, and Oliver Ekman-Larsson and Adam Larson were a pairing, and an extremely fine pairing for Sweden at the World Championships in both 2018 and 19. They won a gold medal together in 2018. I think both of them made the tournament all-star team. They were terrific in that World Championship. So the prospect of bringing him on and pairing him up with Adam Larson does have some appeal, I have to say.
If I could add to that, I understand in the exit interviews, Adam Larson made it very clear to the Oilers that he wants to stay in North America, wants to stay with the Oilers. So there's a conversation about him remaining with the franchise long term. So as to Bruce's point, if you think of Ekman, Larson as your 1-2 for the next 3 seasons, that's a more than serviceable first pairing.
Adam Larson played his best hockey as an Oiler, I think, in January, February of this year. He was an outstanding defensive defenseman in a top pairing role, and then he had a bit of a blip in the playoffs. But he was, obviously he was hurt, so that's frustrating. Okay, I'm going to end this part of the segment with a pointed question, which I want a yes or no answer from both of you, Bruce. And Bruce, your question is. You get the easier question, which is if the Oilers offered first pick this year, Sam Arukov and Chris Russell for Ekman Larson, would you do that deal? Yes or no?
Oh boy. The new news does change the equation that they've got a big gaping hole in the top 4. But boy, would that create salary headaches, even with Russell gone. I would reluctantly, I'll say yes. I understand the impatience and the need to move, but it comes with huge risk.
I'm certainly more on the fence as well. Yeah, I'm on the fence at least. Like I'm on the fence, and I've put you in the spot of having to say yes or no. So if I'm not going to apply that same standard to myself, of course. Kurt, I'll get back to that. Kurt, here's the trade I want you to say yes or no to. The trade is Evan Bouchard or Philip Broberg plus a first plus Chris Russell for Oliver Ekman-Larsson. Kurt, do you do that trade?
I can't give you a yes or no to that because you put variables in your question.
Okay, let's start with Evan Bouchard. Evan Bouchard, Chris Russell, and the first.
Yes.
Philip Broberg, Chris Russell, and the first.
No.
Okay, I would say no to Russell or Broberg. Or not, excuse me, Broberg or Bouchard. That's a no for me. I'm not doing that trade. That's too much to pay for Oliver Ekman-Larsson.
Yeah. See, to me, Ekman-Larsson is a true number one, and I think Broberg can be. I think Bouchard has the chance to be a really good power play guy, but as an overall defenseman, I don't think he'll ever be more than a 3-4.
Okay, that's fair enough. And as for the other question, I guess put it this way, I'm not going to complain about it if it happens. If they give up Samorukov, Russell in the first for Ekman-Larsson, I'm not going to complain, and I will get a hope for the best.
Let me throw one more wrench into this.
Go ahead.
I've kept saying that the Oilers could send Arizona a first. I didn't say their 14th overall pick.
Maybe next year.
I'm not ruling out that the Oilers might not move someone else out this year for a first. So they'd have 2 firsts. So they'd still have one and have one to deal. And that helps move out salary.
Okay, who would they move out, Kurt? This is the obvious question for another first. Can you say?
Who on your club do you think you could get a first for? And let's agree McDavid and Draisaitl are the only 2 untouchables on the team.
You could get a first for Darnell Nurse.
Yep. You
could. You could get a first for Ryan Nugent-Hopkins.
Yes, you could. And I think you could have for a healthy Oscar Klefbom, but you couldn't right now. Anybody else?
Ethan Bear. You could get a low first-round pick for Ethan Bear, I believe.
Maybe, yeah.
I would give.
So there's the wrench that I throw into the works. Don't think just one first. Maybe there's 2 firsts at play here.
Kurt is like, what's that movie? It's the Sphinx. Like the cryptic comment here.
If they trade Nurse and Klefbom's hurt, then OEL's going to have to play about 45 minutes a night.
Well, Jones. I think they have tried out Caleb Jones as a third pairing defenseman 2 years in a row, honestly. And so I think that I don't think he's 23. I don't think it's unexpected or untoward to expect him to be a second pairing, Caleb Jones, a second pairing defenseman this year. He excelled last year in a third pairing role. What did Ethan Bear do before he excelled both as a bottom pairing? And I know, like, you can't use one player and say the other player is going to be just like him. But having watched Caleb Jones and Ethan Bear at the same level, I think Caleb Jones is as good a player as Ethan Bear. So they're different players, but I think you could trust Caleb Jones as your second pairing defenseman this year. So, and
think of how many $1 million defensemen are going to be kicking around the NHL this fall/winter in a flat cap era.
Indeed. To me, Kurt, the key move in this whole thing is moving Chris Russell. And I wonder if Chris Russell, when he had, does anyone know when he had to give that list to the Oilers of his teams that he wouldn't go to? I wonder if he slapped Arizona on that list at the time, or if it's not on the list. Like, would he be a guy who would have put every Canadian team on the list? Chris Russell might not have been that guy. Like, most NHL players just automatically put every Canadian team on their no-go list. But maybe Russell's thinking, well, Calgary I would go to, Vancouver. Maybe he would. He's a little bit of a different kind of guy, Chris Russell. He's a hometown guy.
Yep. I don't pretend to know the answer to that, but I buy your point that Russell's probably not going to be the guy that's going to look down his nose at any particular market. So,
Kurt, that's your assignment for this week, to find out Chris Russell's no goals.
I'll phone down to Caroline and see what I can find out.
Yeah. All right, guys, let's move on and let's deal with some of these other trade rumors which have been swirling. So Darren Dreger of TSN last night had the Oilers interested in OEL. But, I mean, this has been, if you haven't been able, I mean, not to put down Dreger's rumor, he was, it seemed like it was dying down a bit, and Dreger said, no, this is continuing to go along. But the other interesting thing was they're talking about the goalie situation with either Jacob Markstrom or Peter Mrazek being possibilities. I don't see the Oilers having money for Markstrom. I just think that's, I guess if you moved out Russell and bought out James Neal, you might have money for Markstrom and all your other needs, but I don't see them buying out James Neal. And if they moved out Russell, they would need that money elsewhere. So I don't see that level of goalie who's going to get $5 or $6 million a year as a possibility, honestly. Mrazek made $3 million last year. He's been an up and down goalie. He kind of goes from like having a close to a 900 save percentage to close to a 920 save percentage, with more likely to have the 900 save percentage year to year. He's had some really good years and bad years. He's kind of paid fairly highly, $3 million. That didn't seem like it was going to be the cheapest option either. Bruce, what did you think of those rumors?
Well, I think they're looking probably for a 1B or a high 2. We're looking for somebody to play 40 to 50% of the games, with Koskinen likely slated for 50 to 60% at $4.5 million. I don't mind a goaltending budget that's 10% of the salary cap. I mean, every night you're dressing 20 players and 2 of them are goalies. So you like to have a little bit of slush, but around $8 million is good. If the right guy came along, if they got Kemper, then they had to go to $9 million. Well, that's a bit high, but then goaltending suddenly is a strength of your team as opposed to just a break-even point. But an established goalie in the $3 million range is I mean, Mike Smith, by the time they paid his bonuses, was 2.7 something million by the time they prorated that last bonus. So you're not talking about a huge difference from that, and I think you're probably talking about a better goalie in the case of Mrazek. And he is a little up and down, as you say, but he's played in a 1A, 1B situation in Carolina, and he's held his own, at least in that scenario. Like he's not the worst solution, that's for sure.
Kurt?
I do know that the Oilers have inquired about both Kemper and about Mrazek. If you think about Mrazek's past, what connection does he have to today's Edmonton Oilers?
Yeah, played for Holland in Detroit, and this had me worried about the sweet tooth syndrome. Kurt, we saw this play out with former GM Peter Chiarelli, with the Lucic contract, with Spooner contract. So there's a little bit of PTSD on the part of Oiler fans about this sweet tooth syndrome.
Yeah. And fair enough. And you know what? I agree with what Bruce said about percentage of the cap. It makes good sense. If you don't have goaltending, it doesn't matter what else you have. What I will say, though, again, because this is such a unique year with the flat cap, I don't think the Oilers will need to overspend to get a second goaltender that's as good as Mikko Koskinen, because I think the market will be flooded with them. And I think if they hold their cards longer at any position, I think it will be at goaltender, because there will just be so many of them available.
That's my point too. I think like the $3 million for Mrazek, you might not have to pay that much for a goalie as good as Mrazek. I don't think Mrazek is as good as Mikko Koskinen, at least not last year. It could be recency bias on my part, but from watching Koskinen last year, he was a damn good goalie most of the year.
Yep,
a little bit of a slump here and there. Like Markstrom's save percentage last year, they're similar ages, similar sizes. Markstrom's save percentage was .918 and Koskinen's was .917. Yeah. They were I think the 14th and 15th ranked starting goalies for save percentage. Yet there's all this buzz and excitement about Markstrom. Yeah. and people are kind of Koskinen.
Markstrom,
and I get it.
Was good in the playoffs. It's a recency bias.
Yeah,
that's right.
And with Kemper, I mean, people forget that until the last 18 months, Darcy Kemper wasn't a number one goaltender. And we've seen lots of guys, Cam Talbot, who look like a number one goaltender for a season and a half. That happens, right? There's such narrow margins between good and great in the NHL. I'm just not 100% convinced that Darcy Kemper is a true number one goaltender. I think it's more likely he's a 1B or a 2A.
Yeah, there's lots of hype. People are so enthusiastic about Kemper. Brian Burke, I mean, has talked about him in such glowing terms. And you look at his career and you think, well, there's like it's up and down, and then suddenly explosion in Arizona, but Antti Ranta is only a few percentage points behind him in save percentage last year.
Yeah, I'm just not sold.
maybe rent is the way to go. Like, I mean, I think he earns about $4 million a year, if I'm not mistaken. So that's pretty expensive as well.
He does,
So
and
yeah,
he's prepaid. They only owe him 2 million, and they have a 4.25 million cap hit. So he has the same appeal to Arizona that Chris Russell does. Cash lower than cap hit. So
Yeah,
I
and that's a
doubt
real
that he's
key
the guy that
for.
moves. I think it's Kemper that moves.
Yeah, I agree with Bruce. From what I understand about ownership in Arizona the pandemic and the resulting fold in the U.S. economy has really hurt that ownership because their holdings were hit particularly hard. And so they don't have cap issues in Arizona. They have cash issues in Arizona. So I think that will speak to a lot of the decisions that they make in the next month.
well, there's rumors some teams are going to have trouble meeting this next payroll, which starts before the season's going to start. And, if you don't have the money, you don't have the money. Like,
Yeah.
it doesn't just suddenly come out of nowhere. If you don't have the money, and if no one's going to lend it to you, you don't have it. So what do you
I
do?
remember I remember the Rebel League, David, and so do you. So do you,
Yeah,
Kurt.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
All the who's gonna pay for the flight while we fly Wayne Gretzky to Winnipeg or Edmonton? And who was it? Eddie Mio put it on his credit card.
And they didn't even check his limit, right? It was.
Yeah, there's your mandatory 70s sports reference.
So yeah, there's talk about some NHL teams having to move players because they can't pay their bonuses. But I understand the bonuses have already, if I'm not mistaken, I thought the bonuses were paid already to the players who got their signing bonuses this year. So like McDavid, right, who gets most of his money in a bonus, I think he's already been paid if I'm
There
correct
was
about that.
late bonuses reported in Arizona. And if Ranta hasn't got his bonus yet, then maybe that does change the equation. If the
Yeah.
new team takes that on and eats it, then maybe. But
So some guys might be waiting for their money already. Well, the NHL, of course, could give a loan, right, on top of the tens of millions of dollars which have been flushed down the toilet in Arizona already. They could give a loan to the Arizona team to keep that team going.
Gotta love revenue sharing.
I would have loved it. I would have loved it from 1990 to 2005. I have to admit, if I'm not I can't be a complete hypocrite on this point. I would have loved the kind of revenue sharing back then that we have now. On Holland's sweet tooth, the sweet tooth syndrome, the reason it comes up right now is Athanasiou and Green trades don't look very good at this very moment. And part of that is the whole world's changed because of COVID. That's not Ken Holland's fault. And the Athanasiou trade would look a little different with a $85 million cap, $86 million cap. Although if he took the team to arbitration and got $4 million, it might not be looking very good then either. Nonetheless, there is a little bit of concern about former coaches, managers, kind of putting a little bit too much value on players that they know better than others. Tunnel vision, as Bruce indicating there for people listening on the podcast. So I'm a little bit worried about tunnel vision with OEL, honestly. Like, this is to get back to that point. The Tippett really does remember him as the defenseman he was. Now maybe he can be that defenseman again, but it's a concern. And it's mainly because of the Lucic thing, I admit, because it's just so firmly in my head, Kurt. But man, that killed that contract. That one move. This is the kind of move you've got to get right. You've got to get it right. Otherwise, it kills your franchise for 5 years. Yeah. And that's what the Lucic did. The Lucic contract is doing that right now before our very eyes. We still have the James Neal contract killing us because of the Lucic thing, because of one terrible frickin' decision made by a GM with sweet tooth syndrome. So this is my concern about OEL. And
the problem was Milan Lucic was never a $6 million player. He was never a first-line winger, whereas OEL is. I think that's the difference. Because with Lucic, I'm with you, David, and I won't be a hypocrite either. I didn't hate the trade as much at the time as I did now. I'll be honest about that. Yeah. But looking back, it was an awful misstep. But I see these as two different situations.
And they are. They're two different players. But I'm just kind of going by hockey actuarial tables and 29-year-old defensemen. How do players usually do in their 30s? Are the same player they were in their 20s? Well, some really, really good defensemen Lots of really good defensemen can keep playing strong hockey till they're 35 or 36.
And that's the thing about OEL. I've been watching a lot of tape of him, and his skating doesn't look any different to me than it has over the last 10 years. And what are the two unmistakable signs of a player aging and past his prime? One is durability. We've just said he never misses any time. His time in ice is only 30 seconds off his career average. And when you watch him, he's still an elite NHL skater for a defenseman. So yeah, he's 29, right? But he doesn't play like a typical 29-year-old. And that's what gives me more confidence than I might normally.
So it doesn't look like he's lost a step. Yeah. I watched Lucic too to convince myself that was a good trade at the time. I watched him for like six games.
You mentioned that to me.
Yeah. I just watched him 6 games, and then I realized I'm never doing that again because it's so misleading. Like, I honestly think, like, I really like it. For me to weigh in on players from other teams, the point I've reached in my own kind of hockey analysis, I have got to have watched that player play, 20, 30, 40 times, at minimum 20 times, where I'm taking careful notes, watching him play. Yeah. Before I'm going to say with any kind of certainty. So for me, the yes or no question about OEL is really hard because of that. I can't have a credible opinion on his value, if I'm completely honest, because I haven't put in the time to form that opinion accurately. And I know there's some people convinced that they can look at numbers, they can look at various numbers, and they can say with all certainty, with a vast amount of certainty, yes, we should get this player, and yes, I think that is complete and utter BS.
Yes.
There's my hot take of the day. That kind of analysis is complete and utter BS, at least the amount of certainty with which it's often stated. I will use numbers, all kinds of numbers, and I'm in favor of using all kinds of numbers in analysis. But if you're starting to say things with certainty based on the publicly available numbers, at least, I don't even read any of that analysis anymore. I don't think it's worth me reading it because I just don't think it has any much weight attached to it.
If they're that smart, why aren't they a general manager?
Well, if the numbers were that good, I mean, if these publicly available numbers were that good, no NHL GM could make a mistake because you just go on these publicly available numbers and you can go back and look at all the trades based, all the signings like the Benoit Pouliot signing and on based on these numbers and say, oh yeah, that really worked out, and it works out 90% of the time or 80% of the time, or what's a good percentage of the time. So anyway, I'm ripping here, Bruce. Do you have any comment on my comment?
Just that the Oilers have a long history of signing long-term deals, let's call them 5+ year deals, with guys in their young 20s who have covered the bet, and with guys in their late 20s and early 30s who haven't covered the bet.
Yeah, that's fair, because if you look back at those $6 million contracts, you have to say that Taylor Hall was a $6 million player. Mm-hmm. I think in the majority, but not all of the seasons, Jordan Eberle was a $6 million player, if you look at his production. Yeah. And I think Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, in probably at least half or more of his seasons, more recently, I would suggest, than in his past, he's probably a $6 million player. Mm-hmm. So when you look back at those contracts, they don't look bad now. And at the time, and I think two of those were Chiarelli signing, one was a Hall was Tambellini, right?
Hall and Eberle were Tambellini.
Were both Tambellini,
and RNH was McTavish.
Was McT.
And then Chiarelli signed long-term Klefbom, then McDavid, then Draisaitl to very long-term contracts.
All good contracts,
the thing is that in those contracts, 5 years after the contract is signed, the player is 5 years better, and the league salary cap is 5 years bigger, and it becomes more and more value. Whereas you sign a 30-year-old, 5 years later, that guy's 5 years older, and that's no longer a good thing because he's on the other side of that cliff.
And we know the cap's not going up this time, right? This is the other thing about Ekman Larson's contract. Like, it's this $8 million that just doesn't have that inflationary factor working for it. Same with Draisaitl and McDavid's contract. So the Oilers would then have these three massive contracts. Anyway,
I think we can agree those long contracts, for the most part, haven't been the problem for the Oilers. It's been the Nikita and Nikitin contracts that have bit them heads.
Yeah, and Lucic and Pouliot and Sekera that are all still on the payroll in one form or another.
Yeah, Reggie, good pro, right? UFAs. But probably $1.5 million a year too much. So yeah.
The interesting point. So Bruce, you're making a really good point, and what those players have in common is, if you subtract age, is they were generally healthy. So and what we could say is players in their 20s are generally more healthy than players in their 30s. So Kurt, you're contradicting your counter argument is, well, OEL is the exception to the general rule, and that he's been really healthy. He's a healthy guy, and I will acknowledge. I think if you look at which kind of defensemen tend to last longer in the NHL, and what we find is defensemen who can really, really frickin' skate, guys who are great on their skates and don't get injured a lot. That's usually correlating with a player who can continue to play well, and we think of Brian Rafalski, that kind of defenseman, into their 35, 36, 37 years. These guys who've got great wheels. So, again, if they can get him for the first pick, Samorukov and Chris Russell, I think I could live with that.
Have we converted you?
Well, your arguments are, the Klefbom information is also that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the main factor right now. I wasn't thinking about that. He misses time, but he also played really well this year. Oscar Klefbom did, and he's played well in the past. And I don't hold him as high value as some people do, but I think he's a good top 4 NHL, top 4 pairing. Sure. Top 4 on
absolutely.
Your NHL D man. So
I've said to a lot of people, Oscar Klefbom's a 3. That's who he is, right?
Yeah, that's a fair comment, Kurt. I think the Oilers have used him as a 1. But that's probably a little higher use. I mean, he's really adapted well in the power play. He was a fantastic power player this year for the Oilers. Although, again, Chicago did catch on to what the Oilers were doing by the end, and were giving Klefbom the point shot. And that's not the strength of his game, is getting that point shot in a dangerous way, even if the other team gives it up a little bit. Oh, the last of the rumors was Bob Stauffer talking about the Oilers maybe trading down in the draft, trading down from their first pick, maybe 28th to Ottawa, or was it 28th? And then 29th, 30th. There's a couple. I think it's Dallas, and I can't remember who has the other pick. But trading down and getting a second pick for that pick. What do you guys think of that idea, Bruce?
Well, Kurt was mentioning earlier that if the Oilers trade a first to Arizona as part of this deal, if they can trade down first and then trade that, then whatever else they got in that trade is kind of a bonus, depending on what Zona is looking for. The trouble is the Oilers have traded out so many draft picks in these short-term deals. I mean, the next 2 years they're without both of their seconds, 1/3, 1/4, 1/5. So basically, they have their 2 first-rounders for now, and they have a big gaping hole in both drafts where they don't have a lot of picks in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th rounds. So it would help to flesh that out somehow. But if the cost is to trade out from a fairly surefire NHLer to one way down near the bottom of the first round, well, that's the risk. And is it worth the price of gaining, a couple more picks? I mean, the year they traded the Zach Parise pick and they got Mark Pouliot, and with the bonus pick they received in return, J.F. Jacques, they badly lost that exchange. It's certainly possible to win such exchanges, but it's you have to make whatever pick you get back in return. You got to make the top one count. I like where they are at 14. So I'd be reluctant this year they need to come out of the draft with at least one real good player, and that 14 is the ticket to that player. But if you can find a trade down that keeps you in the prime group of bumper crop rookies or draft picks, and add something in the 2nd round, you have to consider it.
Yeah, what do you think of the bill? What is it? Who's the New England guy? Parcells? No, what's the name of the guy who runs the Patriots?
Hoodie. Bill Belichick. That
theory of what you really want to do is have as many bullets in your gun as you can fire off. So you trade down to get more picks because it just gives you, it just increases your odds of getting a good player. Maybe that works in football though, where you're looking for a lot more players, and the one great player isn't really what you're looking for. Where in hockey, that one great player kind of is what you're looking for, rather than replacement level players. You can find those replacement level players, but what you need is a superstar. So maybe the Belichick theory doesn't hold as much. Kurt, what is your take on trading down?
Yeah, I'm reluctant too. I got to say, while the Oilers didn't win the lottery, they did back into a pretty good pick. 14 is better than they should have, could have had. And there's a hell of a lot of good players that are going to be available at 14. I do believe the organization is really trying to figure out a way to add a pick because they know they're down a pint. But I'm with Bruce. Boy, I'd be reluctant at 14. I mean, it always depends what the return is, right? So I guess you never say never, but I'm with Bruce. Give me an R for reluctant.
So one of the things that I like in hockey analysis when using numbers is kind of actuarials, where you look at players at this age, this kind of player, how do they do going forward? You know, what do players like that do? Similar players at age 30, 31, 32. So for the draft, looking at 17-year-olds, someone who's looked at this in depth is Brad McPherson of the Blue Bullet Report. And he's looked at drafts over 20 years or more, and he's assigned what is the actual value of that pick. If the first pick is worth 100 points, what is the value of every pick in terms of what kind of NHL career performance you're going to get out of that player? So for instance, the first pick is worth 100 points, the second pick is worth 84 points, the third pick 65.5 points. When you get down to the 10th pick, it's 26.2 points in terms of NHL career value. So it's about a quarter of the value of the top pick, generally what you're going to get out of the 10th pick. When you get to the 14th pick, it's 1/5 the value of the first overall pick. So essentially you'd need five to get that same value as the first pick. You need five 14th overall picks. It's 21.1. So this gets interesting when you get down to, if you're going to get like the 29th pick and 2 seconds, well, second picks, according to Brad, are generally worth about 4 points each. And the 28th pick is worth 11 points. So we're looking at about 19 points for those. That's 3 picks. That's a late first and 2 seconds, 2 mid-round seconds. That's what did I say? 19 points. And the 14th is worth 21. And if your real goal is to get that one really super player, hanging on to that pick seems, rather than spreading it out among weaker players, hanging on to that top pick seems to make a lot of sense. So I'm in the camp of keeping it. The only way that you change that is this. Let's say the Oilers of scouting staff, we hear this draft is full, absolutely full of top forwards. And let's say the Oilers staff has looked at this list and they said, there's about 8 guys that we could take at 14, and they're all really close. You know, there's Seth Jarvis and Jack Quinn, who, if they're there, we will take them because they're in a whole different category than these other 8 guys. But if those 2 guys are gone, and there's no defenseman that we want or no goalie, and there's these 8 other guys, and they're all kind of the same, if you're completely honest, like, why don't we trade down then? And that's when it would make sense to me. If the scouting staff, with all their hockey acumen and as much as they have watched these players, come to that determination, there's very little to separate these other players, then maybe trading down isn't the worst idea in the world. What do you think?
Yeah.
Well, I do think it's different in a year like this where the draft is deeper. And I wonder if, and I don't know, so I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, but I wonder if his math includes years like this where that depth does reach down to the mid-teens, whereas some years it only goes down as deep as 6 or 7. So I think that's a factor. I buy there's a big difference between first and second and everybody else, because if you make a comparison to the music industry, people often don't understand this. The difference between a number 1 hit and a number 10 hit is thousands and thousands and thousands of spins. People think a number 10 song is a big hit. It is not. It's nowhere close to a number 1. And if you apply that logic to hockey, yeah, a number 10 pick is nowhere close to a number 1. And there's always going to be variables like injury and what have you. But yeah, it's just the higher your pick, the more valuable it is, which is why I'm reluctant to move down.
Hey man, Sweet Caroline never made it to #1 in the charts where I lived, and it had staying power now, didn't it?
Yeah, well,
But yeah, that's the
CCR.
exception that
Look,
proves the
look, look,
rule.
look at all the hits CCR had. They never had a #1. So,
Wow.
Is that right?
yeah.
I think when we look at McPherson's numbers and we say like the 14th pick is worth 21 and the first is worth 100, it's not like you'd get 5 kind of mediocre players. What at 14th overall, and that would add up to the first pick. What that means is like you're going to have, it's almost like a 1-to-1 ratio of getting a great player at #1, although that's not always the case. But with the 14th pick, it's about 1 in 5 that you're going to get that really, really, really good player who's going to drive up the value of all those other 14th picks because he averages together all the drafts. So let's say I can't remember when Alex Hemsky was drafted, but he was around 14th. So he would really drive up that whole group. So what the Oilers are hoping is that they actually, with the 14th pick, they get a player who could be the #1 pick or close to it in a year, any given year. That's really the goal of a first round pick, is that you're going to hit it big and get that top line forward. So, Seth Jarvis or Jack Quinn. Now, with those other 8 players, maybe the Oilers are thinking after Quinn and Jarvis, there really is nobody else who is a great bet, but there's all these kind of okay bets. So why would we waste our 14th pick on an okay bet when we can trade it and maybe get 2 or 3 of these players on our list later in the draft? We can just spread out our bet. So under those circumstances, I think it's a good idea to trade it. But teams hardly ever make this kind of trade in the NHL. And we could say, oh, they just don't understand things. Like they're not smart enough to make this kind of trade. I don't personally believe that. I think they get it. And I think they're not making that kind of trade for a reason, that it usually doesn't make sense. That it's usually they want to get that top line forward, top line D-man, and your best bet by far is to go with the highest possible pick that you can get. And it probably makes more sense if you can trade up in the draft than do anything else. So,
well, in 2003, which was a famously deep draft, when the Oilers traded from 17 to 22, by the time with a lot of players in the pool, by the time they got their pick at 22, Zach Parise had gone at 17, Ryan Getzlaf at 19, Brent Burns at 20. And all of a sudden, that pool was a whole lot shallower than it might have been if they'd have just kept that pick at 17. And there are many other examples of teams trading up or down, but I remember the ones involving the Oilers, and that one still stings.
What's that old saying about birds and bushes?
Hey, Kurt, now that we have you here, I want to ask you about drafting a couple players, and maybe you can't weigh in, because I like when it comes to junior players, don't have much to say at all other than what the consensus of the experts is. But what do you think of the idea of drafting a goalie and Askarov if he's there?
I wouldn't. I think goalies are kryptonite. And in almost every case, these guys, before you know that they're actual NHL goaltenders, they have to spend a year and a half in the ECHL, AHL. It's usually a 3 to 5 year journey, and boy, you're taking such a chance. And again, I'll go back, especially when there is going to be so many goaltenders on the market right now. I wouldn't. I wouldn't rule out taking a defenseman. There's 2 Western Hockey League defensemen out there that'll probably be available between 13 and 16, including the kid out of PA who I really like and I've written about before.
Is that Schneider or Gooley?
Schneider and Gooley are the 2 guys, but
yeah.
Gooley's the guy from PA. Okay. Schneider's right-handed shot, Gooley's left-handed shot. But as I understand, Gooley's a really good 2-way defenseman. But I think it's more likely they'll take a forward. But I think what you do is first round, you take the best player available. And if Schneider and Gooley are one of the 2 best players available at 14, I think you take them.
Yeah, I listening to Brian Lawton on the air, he talks about his preferences to build through defensemen. And I completely agree with that. Like just playing hockey, coaching hockey, you get a good defenseman on the ice, that player dominates the game. Absolutely dominates the game. And we've seen that with Chris Pronger. We've seen it with Victor Hedman this year. We see it with all of these fantastic NHL D-men. If it's me, but the problem with this is, and Jonathan Willis wrote an article about this, is that identifying top defensemen isn't as big a strength as identifying top forwards for NHL scouts. They're much better at picking those top. It's easier to pick the top forwards at age 17 than it is to pick who's going to be the top D-men. So it's just a better bet to take a forward and then make a bunch of bets on defensemen like Caleb Jones and Ethan Bear and John Marino in later rounds.
Yeah. From an asset, sorry, David, from an asset management standpoint, defensemen and centermen are the two positions that hold their value the best.
Yeah.
Right. So I think if you're drafting, you draft D's and C's.
Bruce?
And goalies are, they've become such a mystery that most teams have adopted a policy to not spend their first round pick on a goalie. But if you look back in the history of goalies that were drafted in the first round, there were some mighty fine goalies on that list. From Grant Fuhr and Tom Barrasso ages ago to Roberto Luongo to Carey Price to Andrei Vasilevsky, that were all first round picks that paid off. And in several of those instances, the team sort of said, we got to solve our goalie issue. Let's go and grab this young, highly rated netminder. And in the case of Askarov, we're talking about a best goalie prospect in probably the last 5 years. It's not just this year he's the guy that's bubbling to the top, but he may well be gone before it's the Oilers' turn at 14. So it may be a moot point because there are other teams, I'm looking at you, Carolina, that have an issue to solve between the pipes, and just taking that one home run swing at the real hot shot. It sure worked for Tampa Bay now, didn't it?
It did. And Askarov, to give him some credit, he's not just like as you say, Bruce, he's a little bit of a special goalie prospect. Although 1 year there's like Spencer Knight was talked about pretty glowingly last year. But he is in the KHL this year, which is the second best league in the world. And last time I checked, he was playing games and doing pretty well. So there is that to be said about the player. So again, because I don't watch any of these players, so when a trade's made, if someone's drafted, I tend not to freak out. I tend to hope for the best because I can't really say. So if the Oilers end up drafting this guy who's played 3 games in the KHL this year with a .974 save percentage, which is a very small sample size. If they end up drafting him, I will have questions, but I will be okay with that, and we'll just see how hopefully that's going to work out, because he does sound like an exciting player. But I'm just hoping Quinn or Jarvis. Those are the two forwards most likely to fall to the Oilers. There's Anton Lundell could fall. There's more questions about Anton Lundell in terms of his high-end kind of offensive ability, that it's just not there and doesn't seem like it's going to ever come with this player. So that's a little bit worrisome. And I'm seeing some pretty sharp hockey observers make that comment about Lundell. So that worries me. But I'm just hoping they get one of these guys, Quinn or Jarvis, or maybe it's John Jason Peterka that the Oilers actually are convinced is the, just to pull out one name, is convinced that is going to be that top line forward. I hope we get that guy, the next Yamamoto with the 14th overall pick. He should be there. He is there. They just have to identify him. He is there. They just have to identify him. So that's what I hope happens. Yeah.
Now, the thing about these deep drafts is that you always sort of rub your hands together and say, well, we could get a really good player. Well, guess what? All the other teams are getting good players too. So you got to better pick one to keep up. For example, in 2003, I'll go back there again yet a third time and note that Oilers' divisional rivals, Anaheim Ducks, came out of that with Ryan Getzlaf and Corey Perry. And the Oilers came out of that with Mark Pouliot and his 100-odd NHL games. And that was a big difference between those two organizations for a decade plus after that. Like a huge price to pay when it's a deep draft and you get it wrong.
These team-defining moves, like they really do happen. And it's all about getting that great player who's great for a long time, and the Oilers haven't done a very good job of that at all. And they've ended up with a lot of mediocre players between the ages of 27 and 35 who are getting a lot of money and can't play very well instead. That's been the story of this Edmonton Oilers franchise for a long time, too long. So let's hope they can break that record. All right, guys, anything else? Any other thoughts or closing thoughts?
I have one thing to toss at you. In the next 7 days, the Oilers and the players' camp are going to have to make a decision on Andreas Athanasiou. I'm hearing from multiple people that Taylor Hall is likely willing to sign a 1-year deal, $6-7 million, understanding that the cap is what the cap is, but it's a show me contract. He's willing to go somewhere and say, see, I'm an MVP quality player at, let's say, $6 million. Keep in mind, Taylor Hall's agent is Darren Ferris, the same guy that represents Andreas Athanasiou. So if he's willing to do that with one of his best clients, would he be pragmatic enough to go to Athanasiou and say, oh, why don't you take a couple $1 million and show these guys that you're for real?
Oh, I thought this was heading towards the Oilers saying goodbye to Athanasiou and trying to sign Taylor Hall. I thought it was going to be a...
If COVID hadn't come along, I think the Oilers would have been one of the teams shopping for Taylor Hall. I don't think they are. But there's an agent with 2 players. One of them is already putting out signs that he'd be willing to sign a 1-year deal. And he has way more weight behind him than Athanasiou does.
I think I think that's completely dependent on the player, though, Kurt. Like, I know the agent can lead the player in a certain direction. Definitely. Like, the agent knows the business inside out, knows all the market better. That's his job. It's to know these things, and could direct the player to think that way, and be quite fair and accurate and open and honest and giving good advice and all those things. But 2 different individuals. One guy might value money, and the other guy might have a lot of money. One guy might have $8 million in the bank or $5 million in the bank. Another guy might have $50 million in the bank. And that completely changes and alters their perception. Athanasiou might be thinking, I need to get as much money out of this hockey career as I possibly can while I can get it. And I would not blame him for 1 second thinking that. And if he can get more money elsewhere, he should go. My advice, young man, is go get the money.
Well, I think that's right, but who's the team?
Yeah.
And I think that works in the Oilers' favor, because I think Ken Holland knows that Athanasiou can't get $2 million anywhere else.
Yeah, fair.
Well, the market is, this year's market's going to be very different with the flat cap. I think we're going to find a week from today that there's going to be some pretty good RFAs all around the league that don't get qualified, that are going to flood the UFA market. And some other teams, Athanasiou might come on the market for $2 million, where the other team refused to pay his QO of $3 million. I mean, there's going to be some musical chairs going on there. I think Ken Holland has first of all, he has the disadvantage of negotiating on a qualifying offer based on the generous 2-year, $6 million deal he gave Athanasiou 2 years ago. But because it was him, there's a past relationship with this player, of course. And Holland's selling point is, hey, I treated you fairly last time. I gave you a big contract. You're coming off a tough year. We're in a flat market. You're in a good situation. It's a very good chance that if you play well, you're going to wind up playing with one of the 2 best playmakers in the NHL. 1-year deal. You're going to have a platform after that 1 year where we're going to have a bit of room to maneuver, and then we can talk about a long-term deal. You would rather be talking to us about a long-term deal after a good season than after the season you just had. And I think that's his negotiating platform, and how the player and his camp respond to that, who knows?
And I'll say this, which kind of contradicts what the idea I just put out there. Darren Ferris does not have a reputation for signing club-friendly deals with his clients. Right. He is known as a guy that grinds for his clients, and good on him. We all know how badly NHL players were treated for decades and decades, but he doesn't have a reputation of going, I'll cut you a deal.
But if he doesn't cut a deal, and then the Oilers don't qualify Athanasiou, and he goes on the market and he can only get $1.5 million, he hasn't done him any favors.
I completely agree. Yeah. I think this makes all kinds of sense for the player and for the team. But what are the chances of both of them agreeing at the same time? Don't know.
Most of these players, the last time an NHL player was truly, or in general, were treated badly by NHL owners and the whole system. None of these players were born, I don't think. Like, this is by now some time ago that like these guys since the 1990s have been very well represented, I think, generally speaking, and making top dollars, especially in the last 20 years. But Kurt, I think this market, and Bruce, wait, Ken Holland, don't qualify Athanasiou or Benning. Wait, because I think this is going to be an absolutely brutal market for player contracts. There's just so many teams you hear about, so many teams that are either up against the cap and needing to sign a player or two, or they have a cap where they can't spend, they got to spend the bare minimum or a lower amount of money. Lots is going to happen here, and we'll see what Athanasiou can get. And maybe you're right. If Ken Holland's willing to give $2 million right now, they should maybe jump on that, because who knows where this could go for a lot of players. And I just like the idea of Ken Holland keeping his powder dry and waiting. That even paid off when the cap was going up with Chris Russell's first contract, Riley Sheahan's contract. We've seen how that pays off. You just have to be patient, and good things very often will come to you, and definitely will this year. So let the other teams. No, Jeff Petrie just signed. What did he sign for? Was it $6 million, $6.5 million a year for 4 years?
$6.25 million times 4 years, starting in 2021.
There was no urgency in Bergevin making that deal, as far as I can tell. Why not wait for a month until the market has just hammered all these players, and then say, okay, Jeff, let's talk contract now? Because then suddenly you think, well, the price for a number one D man isn't 6.5 in a year per year. It's 5. And that's what you're going to get. I don't know why Holland went with, he gave those, thank goodness he didn't give Sheahan a contract in January as well when he gave Archibald and Cassian deals. Thank goodness that didn't happen, because, and any GM, I think, lavishing big money right now at this moment and first in, I think that's a mistake. Especially
for contracts that don't even begin until a year from now, like the Brodin contract or the Petrie one.
I don't know what they're kind of basing it somewhat on the old market, I think. Why not see this new market? Now, maybe they know more than me. Maybe this market's going to be the same, generally speaking, for players. I don't think so. That's not what I'm seeing. So we'll see.
And the other point that I've made before, and I'll make it again because it's becoming more relevant, is you give one of these guys a qualifying offer, all of a sudden now he has the hammer that he can take you to arbitration. I'm talking about Athanasiou and Benning both. And Athanasiou takes the order, say they put out the $3 million, say, well, I guess we can afford $3 million for the player we thought we were getting. And the player says, I'm going to take you to arbitration. And the arbitrator goes, well, he scored 30 goals the year before last, and he's averaged over 20 goals for the 2 years on his contract. And based on past precedent, players that have performed this much get a raise of 25% or something. And now all of a sudden you're talking about the arbitrator coming back at $4 million instead of $3 million. And the team can't even walk away unless he exceeds a threshold of something like $4.538 million this year. So anything going to arbitration is potential disaster for the teams. I think you'll see all the teams avoiding arbitration. So if they are going to come to terms with these guys, even if they're going to make the qualifying offer, they're not just going to make a QO, they're going to sign the guy and say, if you're not willing to sign for this qualifying price, forget it. So I don't think you're going to see much in the way of potential arbitration cases, because the arbitrators might go on, here's the realities of 2020, flat cap, teams that got squished on their margins by a significant amount. The Oilers, they got, instead of having 12 million to spend, they got 8 million to spend. But if the arbitrator's going based on past precedent includes always the salary cap going up and up. So unless that's established, how the arbitrator is going to go about doing business, getting involved in any of those potential situations is an absolute no-go as far as I'm concerned.
Alrighty. Well, thanks for talking today, Kurt and Bruce. That was a lot of fun.
Always great to see you, fellas.
Oh, you bet. Nice to see you, Kurt. You too.
And in the sorry, Bruce. That's okay. We always
thanks for listening, everyone.
And in the meantime, and in between times, this has been another edition of the Cult of Hockey podcast.